Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 111 of I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive. My name is Mike, and that is Gavin. And Gavin, don't you hate it when things change?
I sure do, buddy. And if you're referring to our technology things that I believe we talked about them just a little bit at the beginning of last episode. So hopefully you all will never know the difference. But Mike and I are looking at each other through Zoom, which we've never actually done before. We've recorded a couple episodes in person, but we've never done one like over Zoom, which is interesting. It's a new experience. Mike is seeing my apartment here for the first time.
And I'm laying down on the couch. I'm not wearing pants, for the record. Like this,
Sick.
It's a strange, like we've done this, 100-something times one way, and now we got to change. So, I'm not saying that the change is always bad, but got to get used to it.
This one sure is annoying, I will say. If you want more details, go back and listen to the beginning of last episode if you haven't yet. But anywho, episode 111, that's a lot of episodes. What day does this go out, Mike? And what happened in ye olden times of the past?
So this is going to go out on May 3rd of this year.
Yep.
And when I was looking through things that happened on this date in the past, I found something and I said, I'm not entirely sure how this works. Or what this means, but I'm just going to tell Gavin anyways. And one thing that I have wanted to do for a while is like read a book or something on just the history of the internet, and how we go from Al Gore inventing it to to today, and all the steps in between. But so in 1978, which is before the World Wide Web,
sure.
In 1978, the first unsolicited bulk commercial email, or spam, is sent by Digital Equipment Corporation marketing representatives to every ARPANET address on the U.S. West Coast. So apparently email was a thing in 1978, and the spam email became a thing in that
shortly thereafter.
Right. I believe ARPANET was a U.S. military program. That's part of where the internet comes from. But
that sounds right.
This is all stuff I am very interested in, but I have no actual knowledge of, is internet history stuff. So, yeah, that's what I got today for our Today in History.
And it has continued to plague the world all these last, what year was it, 78?
1978.
Yeah, in these last, 45 years?
I don't even know how numbers work.
That sounds right. That. Well, it sounds a nice round number. We'll stay with it.
Tell you what, I'm not going to check. So, let me get that out of the way. Gavin, you wanna hit us with some housekeeping?
Why, yes, Mike. I would love to make some, or to keep some house here. Do not forget to rate the show on whatever platform you listen to us on, as well as to follow us on our various social medias, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, etc. And actually, I haven't tried it out yet, but I've seen good things. Back a couple months ago, everybody was moving from Twitter to Mastodon, and I'm like, that's never going to happen. But I guess there's a new Twitter competitor called Blue Sky that I actually have downloaded. I haven't opened it yet, but I've heard good things.
Okay.
So maybe next episode we'll have a Blue Sky account. Stay tuned.
That's
anyway,
exciting.
on all that social media garbage. Yeah, we'll see. Especially with Twitter, going to be much more unusable probably by the time this goes out. I think starting tomorrow at the time we're recording this, Elon is ruining the For You feed. But anyway, not important to this podcast. Anywho, follow us on all that social media garbage. In order to provide us feedback on the show, how we're doing, as well as any topics you might like to hear on future episodes of the podcast. And if you would like to be a guest, we have a form down below in the show notes for how you can do that. And I also don't know what we're doing next time, so I'm going to edit that in later. All right, so the house has been kept. Mike, how are you with tentacles?
I'm going to need a little bit more context to be able to answer that question. Yeah. So, I don't feel comfortable answering that given the information I currently have.
That is the absolute correct response. Today, dear listeners, since you saw the title, we are talking about cephalopods, which, if you are not familiar, they are the group of mollusks that have tentacles, or more accurately, arms. Only some of them have tentacles, and we'll talk about that. But these are your octopus, your squid, your cuttlefish, and your nautilus. Those are the four sort of distinct groups that are around today, as well as many extinct groups.
What was that last one?
Nautilus. And we'll talk about them at length today.
We're going to have to.
Yeah. Because you can pretty easily picture at least, most people with octopus and squid. Cuttlefish are a little different, but basically squid. And then the nautilus is the real weird one. But around today, there are around 800 species, which is very likely an underestimate. Since, especially with like deep ocean stuff, we have kind of no idea how many things are really down there. That's not to say that, like, I always hate when people are like, so we don't know what's in the deep ocean, so Megalodon could be down there. And I'm like, no, you're wrong.
Yep, that's not how that works.
But with things like octopus, especially, there absolutely could be a large number of octopus species that live down very deep in the ocean that we don't know about yet. Or even just ones that live on reefs, because reefs are just really widespread and diverse. But like I said, give or take 800, as well as over 17,000 named fossil species, which is also likely an enormous underestimate.
What makes you say it's an underestimate?
Number one, just the nature of the fossil record. We never get everything, so any number of species you see for an extinct group is always going to be an underestimate. But also, for reasons we'll talk about, a lot of these guys don't fossilize particularly well, mostly because they're squishy. They're generally pretty soft, especially things like the octopus. We'll get there at the very end of this episode. Octopus have virtually no fossil record. So,
no bones, right?
Exactly. None of these have bones, even the ones that we do have good fossils of, because these are invertebrates. But even things like lots of invertebrates have hard parts. Things like clams, insects have pretty hard shells that fossilize pretty well for how small they are. So invertebrates can have hard parts that fossilize well. In fact, that is the vast majority of the fossil record is invertebrate hard parts. But in the invertebrates that don't have hard parts, they just kind of leave us with a lot of questions, so we don't have a great way of answering. But we'll talk about that.
Okay.
And really quick, before we get into any of the real science or anything about these animals, I want to address something up front that always bothers me. And that is the plural of some of these groups of animals. So, with squid, with squid, pretty easy. The plural of squid is squids. With nautilus, the plural is nautili, as you would expect. Things like cactus.
Sure.
So, however, with octopus, it is not octopi. That is not correct.
Why not?
Because ending the plural of something that ends in us, like cactus, and turning it into an I for cacti, that assumes that root is Latin. But in octopus, it is actually Greek, and that's not how you pluralize Greek words.
But why does it make a difference if you and I are both speaking English and you know what I mean when I say octopi?
Because the plural is actually better than octopi.
Okay.
So, there are two correct plurals. The actual correct English one is just octopuses.
Mm-hmm.
But if you were like me and very pedantic and kind of a jerk about it, the technical correct plural is octopods.
I would love for one of my real smart students, to just drop octopods somewhere in class, and then, like 3 hours later, I found out they were shoved into a locker or something. Like, man, if you're gonna be dropping octopods, like come on, man.
You might not like it, but this is what peak performance looks like.
Well played.
So,
well played.
Yes,
all right, so octopuses or octopods, and
Yes.
not octopi, even though, like, everyone knows what you mean when you say that. Sure.
Right. It's like, again, I'm just being very pedantic about it. If you say octopi, I'm not going to be, like, if somebody said that in casual conversation, I wouldn't correct them. I'm not that much of a jerk about it. But
Are you sure?
being that you sound doubtful. But given that this is a
podcast.
Yes, exactly. Even that this is a scientific podcast, I want to be accurate about it.
Understood.
Yes. So, with that out of the way, let's talk about this group of absolute freaks. So, it's kind of weird because this whole group of animals is just so utterly bizarre and foreign to us vertebrates up here on land, that these guys are just absolutely very strange. So I'm going to talk just for a quick second about their different groups, and then we're going to talk about all of their sort of anatomy and sort of features. So it's mainly split into two groups. The first one being the nautiloids. We will talk much more about them later. There are 5 species today, and they all have external swirly shells.
Okay.
So in the past, we have mentioned the ammonites, that I've frequently referred to as the swirly.
Yeah.
Yes, the swirly-shelled squid boys. That is not these, and we'll talk about their differences in a little bit, but they look very similar from someone who doesn't know the differences. So they are basically a shell that sort of spirals in on itself, and then out of sort of a hole, or sort of like a cone-shaped opening at the bottom, a squid-like animal comes out. So there are 5 species of those today, almost all found in like Southeast Asia in relatively like not deep, but deepish waters. And then, so that's one group that's alive today. The other 795 plus species are part of a group called the coleoids, which all either have an internal shell or have since lost their shell. So things like squid or cuttlefish especially have something that I'll talk about in a little more detail sort of internally that gives them structure. Whereas some octopus have a very small portion of this, but a lot of octopus don't have any of this shell remaining at all. So that's sort of the 2 main groups we're working with here, with the nautiloids over doing their own thing with their shells, and then the coleoids over here being less shelled.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about some body parts here. So picture just an octopus. Most people are like vaguely familiar with what an octopus looks like.
I sure hope so.
So the part that actually looks like its head, so not where all the arms are, but the rest of it, that is actually called the mantle, and that is basically its entire body. That's where all of its organs are. That's where its gills, its heart, its stomach, that all of it is up there. That's not really its head per se.
Okay.
The spot with the eyes and all of the arms is actually kind of what, anatomically, if you were to compare it to its other relatives like snails, because snails are reasonably closely related to cephalopods, that is sort of their equivalent of a head, and also like the foot, the part of that the snail walks on. That's what makes up the arms. Granted, cephalopods and snails have been separated for like over 500 million years of evolution, so they're real different, but that is the part that it sort of evolved from. And so let's talk a little bit more about the arms, because I mentioned earlier tentacles. Tentacles and arms are different in cephalopods. The octopods have 8 arms and no tentacles. The octopus do not have tentacles.
All right.
Again, this is just a scientific definition distinction thing here. If you said tentacle, people would know what you're talking about.
Can we define what our terms are then? Like when you say that octopuses don't have tentacles, but they do have arms. What does that mean?
It's mostly sort of their shape. So if you can imagine, think of a squid, how they have all the arms and the 2 longer ones that are sort of wider at the end.
Okay.
Those are the tentacles.
But what is a tentacle and what is an arm in this situation?
So tentacles, I guess let's start with arms. Arms have the suckers, like suction cups, exactly like what you would think an octopus has. Tentacles have only those at the very tip, at sort of a broader, widened section. And they're also sometimes, especially in like the larger squids, like barbed. So they're not like a literal suction cup, they're like hooks.
Mm-hmm.
And those are
Okay.
used to shoot out. They mostly keep them sort of like tucked up in the arms, because squid also have arms. With the like octopus suction cups. So they sort of keep those sort of stored up in the arms, and then they shoot them out to grab food and pull them in. Octopus don't have those.
Okay.
So, I guess a better way to sort of visualize it is think of Squidward.
Right.
How his hands kind of come to like a diamond almost shape at the end.
Right.
But he doesn't have suckers like all the way up his arm up to his body.
Mm-hmm.
That's like a tentacle.
And that's just like his arm, like his arms as though he were a human, or was that including his legs?
Yeah,
Okay.
not including the legs.
Gotcha.
Yeah, so octopods have 8 arms, no tentacles. Squid and cuttlefish have 8 arms, 2 tentacles. And then there's the nautilus, which has, depending on the species, and even sometimes depending within the species, can have somewhere in the ballpark of like 80 to 100 arms. Yeah, they do.
That's significant.
They're very different though. In the octopods and squid and cuttlefish, the arms, like I said, have suckers, and each sort of little suction cup is individually controlled. So think of each suction cup like a finger, where they can individually control whether each one is like applying the suction or not.
Jeez. Okay.
Yeah. And then, like I said, squid and cuttlefish have tentacles with sharp, sometimes like toothy, almost hooks at the end that they shoot out and catch the prey. Then the nautilus, their arms don't have suckers or hooks. They're just sort of like muscular things that they used to like wrap around stuff. And they're not even sort of like really like stretchy or elastic like octopus and squid arms are. A lot of things about nautilus confuse me, and I don't know how these arms are at all practical. But as we'll talk about, they've been doing pretty well for a long time, so they must be doing something right.
Right.
So, yeah, they're very strange. They're still like flexible enough to like wrap around stuff, but not like enough to sort of change, like stretch and stuff like octopus arms. All of these cephalopods have a beak that looks, if you know what like a parrot beak looks like, they all look very similar to that, except generally sharper. And that's their mouth. And in fact, in a lot of octopus, that is the only like hard part in their entire body is their beak.
So what is that made of then, their beak?
I believe like keratin or chitin. So just sort of generic animal hard material, similar to like fingernail or like bug shell material almost.
Gotcha, okay.
And as anybody who's tried to keep an octopus like in captivity knows, if they can fit their beak through, they can fit through that spot.
I have seen some videos of octopods just like escaping just wild habitats. Like they're sneaky little creatures.
Oh, absolutely. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. We have a brief section on sort of their intelligence, and we'll talk about that a little bit there. And this beak is just sort of the generic mouth for squid, cuttlefish, nautilus. But in octopus, it's a little different because all octopods are venomous. All of them.
Really?
Definitely one, arguably a couple, are like medically significant to people. But they're all venomous to their prey. And that is the blue-ringed octopus in the Pacific Ocean. So if you see like a yellow octopus with blue rings on it, stay away. That there's a solid chance that could kill you.
Really? How do they deliver their venom?
Through their beak.
Okay.
Yep. So granted, you have to kind of try, but they're pretty fast, especially like the these Pacific blue ring octopus, they're big too. They can have, arm spans of several feet. So they can sneak up on you pretty quick. As I mentioned before, all of them except for some octopus, but for all intents and purposes, all of them except octopus have some kind of shell, which is pretty characteristic of all mollusks. So the other mollusks are things like snails, clams, and a handful of other groups that most people probably haven't ever heard of. But for the most part, the most common ones are bivalves and snails. And like their mollusk cousins, the nautilus has an external shell that it can pull all of its 90 plus tentacles into. And they even have sort of like a little trapdoor that they can close over top of it. It's like sort of fleshy, so it's not the best defense. Yeah, so it's not like another flap of shell or something. Some snails have like a trapdoor made out of shell. This one is just sort of like hardened, like skin, essentially. But they can just sort of shoop and pull everything into the shell. Whereas things like squid and cuttlefish have sort of like an internal rod, almost, of shell material. And in squid, it's called a gladius because it is vaguely shaped like Roman swords, which I think is fun. And that's what, back in ancient Rome, that's what their swords were called, or gladius. And anybody who has ever had a pet, like bird, is probably familiar with a cuttlebone, which is just sort of like an oblong oval made out of basically pure calcium that cuttlefish have. And it's very common to give to birds and other pets as like a source of calcium. They'll just chew on it and eat it and get calcium, especially birds in particular for their eggs.
Okay.
But yeah, you can just go to a pet store and buy a cuttlefish shell. That's very common.
I have a question just about, so what were the four types of species that we're talking about? We have octopuses, squid, what were the other two?
Cuttlefish,
and the last one?
Nautilus.
Are these all water-dwelling creatures?
Yes, all of them.
Okay.
And I believe, I'm going to put a caveat on this, but I believe, at least today, they're all exclusively saltwater. I don't believe there are any freshwater ones. I think there's a couple, like, brackish, saltish water that, like, don't mind bays and stuff. But, yeah, I don't believe there's any, like, lake or river octopus. And I don't believe there has been, although don't quote me on that.
Understood. Okay. Sorry to interrupt. It was just something that all of a sudden came to my head. Like, ooh, am I missing something, or are they all water?
No, I think it's a fair question, especially with things like I mentioned, like their closest living relatives are things like snails, and there's lots of land snails and slugs and things. But yeah, to my knowledge, no, there's not even any freshwater ones.
Gotcha.
So that's it about their shells. We'll talk much more about their shells when we talk about their fossils, because that's, pretty much all we have for the fossils. Their eyes, particularly for invertebrates, are very strange, because especially in squid, anatomically, they are virtually the same as vertebrate eyes. They work and look almost exactly the same as, like, your own eyes. Compared to things like the compound eyes of insects, or even in, like, snails, a lot of the time it's just sort of like a light sensor where they can't make out images particularly well. But in cephalopods, their eye is structurally basically the same as, like, a human eye.
Is there an advantage or disadvantage to one kind of an eye over another in a water environment?
It depends what you're using it for. Like snails and things, they're all, I guess not all. There's a number of predatory snails, but
Predatory. That'd be a great bad movie. Predatory snail.
But things like cone snails have, like, a projectile that they shoot out. So, like, they have decent vision to be able to, see fish to shoot them. But all cephalopods, and to my knowledge, even all of them, like, in the fossil record, I don't believe there's been any that have, been interpreted to not be this, but all of them are predatory and, like, active, chasing down prey. And to do that, you need to see them. So, why, in particular, this sort of, it's referred to as a camera style eye, why they decided to, go down that route like vertebrates did. I'm not quite sure. It might be that they're generally pretty good under pressure, so like in deeper oceans. They're also let you change like the sensitivity of it by changing like the iris size. They're just very flexible. And so that might be the reason why, but I didn't see too much about why they're so similar.
Just that they are similar?
Yeah. Like I said, I'm sure that there are papers and stuff written about it, but I didn't read them. Moving on from other parts of sort of their nervous system, their brains are very strange compared to what we think of as a brain. And so most invertebrates don't have a brain per se. Instead, they have their brain sort of spread out throughout most of their entire body, and it can be sort of concentrated in certain areas that are called ganglia, but they don't have like a single brain in one spot like you think of like your brain is in your head. That's why a lot of insects, their heads can be chopped off and they're still function for a while.
That's just nuts.
Yeah. And so that's just invertebrates in general. But for these folks, the cephalopods, I'm not quite sure about the nautilus. I didn't see too much about nautilus brains in particular. But for octopods and squid, they sort of have a ring of nervous tissue around their beak area. And it sort of then extends down into each of the arms. And that's probably part of why they have such granular control over each of the suckers, is because their brain technically is sort of right there in the arm. And, each arm has its, ganglia, these nerve cell clusters sort of all throughout them. And I've even seen it that like certain squids can like give themselves headaches if they try to eat something too big, because it puts pressure on that like ring around their beak.
Okay.
Yeah, they can like give themselves like a concussion effectively by eating something too big.
Incredible.
Yep. Each arm also, on top of having this brain in it, can sense light. It can't like see like an eye, but it can tell light from dark just by having some photoreceptors along the arms. Each arm can taste or smell, because those are effectively the same in the ocean, and touch. And they all process all of that information that they're taking in sort of by themselves. So that they don't need a central brain, because each arm is processing its own information that it is bringing in from all of its own sensory stuff.
Like, so I sort of understand, and I also just, like, it's just such a foreign concept for something like that to be happening that I don't think I actually understand. Like, you can say those words, but
yeah,
it's just nuts. It just is.
It is very strange. And, like, I'm not even, I don't fully understand it, either. But there's a reason why, like, a lot of sci-fi things have like some of their like space species have like squid heads or something like that, because this is like, and especially like I said, we'll talk about their intelligence here in just a couple minutes, but for being as intelligent as they are, but their brain just like functioning and being structured so fundamentally different than ours, that's like as close as we're gonna get, at least like probably in our lifetimes, you and I, Mike, to like an intelligent alien species is squid and octopus.
I have no idea whether or not in our lifetime that's going to be the case, but I'll let you make that bold claim.
I'll claim that. I said intelligent alien life, not just alien life.
That's a big caveat there.
Yep. So moving on away from their brain stuff for just a little bit here. Their skin is also kind of crazy, and that especially in octopus. as well as cuttlefish are pretty good at it too. They, their skin can change color to basically any color that they want it to. That's probably also another reason that they have really good vision, is because especially squid and cuttlefish, because they tend to live more on reefs and like hang out like on the reef instead of like in the water around it. They can change their skin color. They can change their skin texture. They can like grow little growths up off of the arms and stuff to blend in with the shape and structure of the reef. Just like kind of at a moment's notice. They use this very often for camouflage as well as to communicate to one another. They can sort of talk by flashing different patterns at each other. I wouldn't quite call it a language, but as we'll mention in a little bit, it's kind of not language. And some also use a sort of flashing pattern to disorient prey while hunting. Cuttlefish especially will do that. They'll like flash their colors so quickly that it like almost kind of gives fish seizures. And then they just swim over and eat it.
I mean, that's a pretty fantastic mechanism there. Like, it would be a predatory mechanism?
Yep.
Okay.
I'm sure it'd work pretty well on anything trying to eat them as well. Because that's another thing. One of the things that I've seen referenced, I don't know how like scientifically supported it is, but the reason why cephalopods are so smart is because they're delicious. They're so soft and squishy. Everything in the ocean will eat an octopus if given the chance.
Okay.
So you got to be kind of crafty to figure out how to not get eaten all the time. Some other features, all of them but the nautilus have ink that they can shoot out, and that is purely defensive. Mostly that's made out of melanin, the same pigment that makes like human skin or hair darker colored, same exact pigment. How they move, just moving through the water, is very strange. They use jet propulsion. So if you've ever seen a jellyfish move, how they sort of flap almost.
Yeah.
That's how jellyfish move. And if you watch cartoons, that's very often how octopus and squid move, but that's not how they move in real life. They will bring in water into their mantle, so sort of the octopus like head shape structure. And then they have an organ called a siphon that they literally just like shoot water out of, and it moves them through the water. Just like a jet engine sort of brings in air one side and pushes it out the other. And if you've ever seen like an octopus just like cruising through the water without really moving its arms or anything, that's what it's doing. That's really inefficient though. It burns a lot of energy, and it also puts some weird pressure on their body cavity, which is where their heart is. So their heart can't beat while they're doing that.
Okay. That seems like a problem.
Yeah. For the most part though, they only do that for like when they need quick bursts of movement. So for octopus, they mostly crawl around using their arms. Squid and cuttlefish have like fins on the side of the mantle that they like flap, that they move with. And I believe nautilus have to use the jet propulsion, but they're really efficient at it because they, instead of just putting all that pressure on their mantle, they have the shell that can support that pressure.
Now, you mentioned jellyfish here. Are jellyfish and any of these, are they related to what is the term we're using here?
Cephalopods.
Cephalopods. Are they a cephalopod?
Nope.
Okay.
Jellyfish are a cnidarian, which are like very, very early branching group of animals. They have no organs. They have no nervous tissue, basically at all. Super, super simple. So they are in the same group as like corals and sea anemones, but not these guys.
Gotcha.
All right, so that's enough about sort of their anatomy for the time being. And before we get to any of the fossil stuff, let's talk just for a little bit about their intelligence, because that's been kind of a hot button topic on like at least a lot of the wildlife like meme pages that I'm on Facebook. I think even a couple of years ago there was like a documentary that came out called My Octopus Teacher or something like that.
What? Okay.
Yeah, where it's like this guy, this documentarian guy just spent a bunch of time with like a single octopus on a reef, just out in the wild. I don't think it was captive, just like scuba diving. Yeah, I don't know. I haven't seen it. I've only heard things about it. But that in particular kicked off a lot of like this kind of conversation. So this is regarding cephalopods in general, but particularly octopus. And with this huge upfront caveat in that it's very hard to discuss intelligence in non-human animals. And that it's also just very hard to discuss intelligence in human animals as well. We're not particularly good at quantifying intelligence, even in humans, let alone things whose brains we don't particularly understand. So all of this intelligence stuff with that big caveat up front. But no matter how you look at it, though, no matter how you try to quantify it, cephalopods are by far the most intelligent invertebrates. So besides, fish, amphibians, mammals, birds, and reptiles, by far the most intelligent, things without bones. And even then, they're generally sort of ranked, if you can rank it, somewhere between like reptiles and birds and mammals.
What do you mean by rank? Like, what do you mean?
So if you were to sort of rank rank different groups of animals by intelligence, they would place somewhere above reptiles, but below birds and mammals.
Yep, gotcha.
And so, like I said, it's very hard to understand, particularly their intelligence, because their nervous system just functions so utterly differently than ours. And, for example, even things like sharks and humans, we seem really different, but fundamentally, sharks and humans are working with the same original set of hardware. So it's like we at least understand how their brain works because it works fundamentally the same as ours. But cephalopods just totally take that, toolbox and just throw it out the window. They have something totally different. So it's just hard for that way. And then also, cephalopods, particularly octopus, again, don't live very long.
How long is that very long?
Yeah, so in squid, they can live for a handful of years. In captivity, like cuttlefish have been known to live for, like 10 years maybe. Nautilus live quite a long time. Like 20 plus years is not uncommon for them. But in octopus, the longest living octopus is about 5 years, with most of them being 2 to 3.
Wow.
Yep.
When did they reach, like, is there adulthood in octopuses, or is that not a thing?
Yes. So generally, it is right at the end of that, because octopus, especially octopus, and I believe all of them except nautilus, die after spawning.
Wow.
Yep. So the male, a little reproductive anatomy as well. One of the arms of male octopus functions as their sex organ.
Nice.
So they will rip it off, hand it to a female, and then just die.
Okay, that's nice when you say it like that.
Yeah. And then the female uses that to fertilize her eggs, and then she will basically just not eat and waste away guarding the eggs until around the time that they hatch, and then she dies. So they only reproduce once, but especially in octopus, they produce thousands and thousands of eggs. But this short lifespan makes it harder to do longer term like learning experiments on them, because you can only deal with that same individual for at most like a year from the time it's like big enough to interact with, because they start off as like basically microscopic larvae. So you've got like at most a year to like actually teach it things. Another way that is sort of used in general to talk about intelligence is something called the encephalization quotient, which is basically just like the mass of the brain compared to the mass of the rest of the body. So if you have a really big brain, but your body is also really big, that doesn't necessarily mean you're that intelligent. So think of like a bison versus a monkey. So a bison is really big and it has a really big brain. And a monkey is really small.
The size of the animal.
Right.
Yeah.
A monkey is pretty small, but its brain for its body size is really big. So, and in general, octopus, I think this is where that sort of ranking comes in with like their intelligence. It's like their encephalization quotient is somewhere above lizards but below birds and mammals.
Mm-hmm.
That's all I'm really going to talk about with intelligence for like how we quantify it and things. This entire part could be like several episodes by itself. But here are some cool things that they have been known to do that is just bizarre when you think about it. So, octopus have been known to use like clamshells or coconut shells as armor while crawling across the ocean floor. They will find it and store it for later. Like they'll just carry it around. Like, in case I need this, because I am so tasty, I'm going to carry it around. They will also... Yeah. They'll also gather rocks, shells, and bits of broken glass, so not even things that are like natural in their environment, to build walls in front of their den as like an extra form of protection. So they'll go out and like search and just like, I don't even have a den yet, but I like this rock. I'm going to keep it with me and just like in one of my suckers as I'm moving across the ocean. And also in the lab, they've been known to do this with Legos as well. They will build things out of Legos. One species of octopus. Have you ever heard of a Portuguese man-o-war?
Nope.
So it is an extremely venomous... it's a weird animal. It's jellyfish adjacent, but is extraordinarily venomous. There's a species of octopus that is immune to that venom, but will seek them out and basically use their venomous like jellyfish tentacles as both a defense and to catch food. They'll use another animal's body parts that is deadly to just about everything and use it to stab stuff with.
I mean, that's pretty cool.
Yeah. They are really good at problem solving. They've been known to unscrew bottle caps to get at stuff inside. They can open plastic latches holding like a lid on a box. And they will remember how to do this for weeks once they figure it out. And they can even like apply that to like a totally different box that has like different latches. They'll be like, that looks kind of like the one I solved last week. Maybe if I do it this way, I'll get to the food inside like I did last time. And they, like I said, weeks, which is pretty insane for just an octopus. And also, just to point out again how difficult it is to keep a captive octopus, they're very good at problem solving in that if they want to get out, they will get out.
I believe that.
And lastly, some things about communication, particularly in squid. Octopus are rather antisocial. In fact, most of them are cannibalistic. But squid are very social animals in that they can, like I said, more or less speak to each other using different flashing patterns on their skin. And they'll even purposely exclude certain individuals from a conversation they're having. So if there's
That's
three of them,
amazing.
if there's three of them lined up, the one in the middle will like flash some lights just on one half of its body so that one squid can see it, but the other one can't.
Incredible. Well done.
Yeah. So it's like, again, it's like not language, but not terribly far from having, the forethought to be like, I don't want this other squid to know what I'm talking about right now.
We are approaching that at that point.
And if you want to know more about any of this intelligent stuff, please look it up. It is fascinating. But that is enough about all of these living squids and friends. Let's talk about the fossils. The fossil record of cephalopods is simultaneously immaculate and really bad, depending on which group you're trying to study.
Okay.
In the Cambrian period, so this is the earliest major period with a large amount of like complex animal life. So this is in the ballpark of 540 to 485 million years ago. So this is a long, long time ago. This is when the first cephalopods were the first ancestors of cephalopods kind of show up. And the general thought is that they evolved from something not quite a snail, but similar. So imagine a snail that instead of having sort of like the slightly curled sideways shell that like a snail kind of has, imagine a more like cone shaped shell that just sort of sat on the back of a snail that didn't like curl like that.
Okay.
And that's
just like a,
yeah, so imagine just like a shorter, kind of stubbier, and slightly like backward curved, like ice cream waffle cone, essentially. And that is basically what we think cephalopods eventually evolved from. And we have lots of fossils that look something like this. And cephalopods, their shells have a couple of features that snail shells don't. And this is what makes them different from snails. There's a lot of things are based on the shell because that's all the fossils we have from these early time periods. Firstly, cephalopod shells have chambers. Like I said, the most famous nautilus that's around today is called the chambered nautilus because of the chambers in its curly shell. So basically, if we're still picturing this sort of ice cream cone, every so often they will just like put a wall in, sort of separating like the opening of the cone from the tip of the cone. So it's just like every so often they'll just put a new one in, and then the animal itself just mostly lives in sort of the opening part.
Why is that? Why do they need like new walls?
Well, it's mostly thought that that was originally a buoyancy thing.
Okay.
Yeah. So, when you're living in the water, generally gravity's not that much of an issue, but staying upright is still pretty important. And so,
okay.
Yeah. So they also have what is called a siphuncle, which is basically a tube that connects all of the chambers. And so by doing some like complex chemistry stuff, they can basically take gas out of their blood and use it to fill these chambers with gas or water to move themselves up or down. And back then, these were still snail-like things living on like the bottom of the ocean. But if you put just a little bit of gas up at the tip of the cone part of the shell, that will keep you upright and keep you from falling over. So that's originally what we kind of think why they started developing like the chambers and the tube, the siphuncle for. However, by the end of the Cambrian and getting into the next period, the Ordovician period, they got up off of the ocean floor and started swimming around. And by that point, once you're actually moving up and down in the water, that buoyancy becomes much more important. Because if whatever you're chasing after to eat swims downward, you need to be able to follow it.
Right.
And so throughout this early part of Earth's history of complex life, cephalopods were some of the first like large predators. And from what I could find, they've always all been predators. So once a lot of like the weirdo Cambrian things, just like the weird evolutionary experiments that just didn't pan out in the Cambrian when everything was still really new, once all of those things went extinct, cephalopods were sort of like the main predators to start out after that.
Okay.
However, these chambered shells actually do have some limitations to them, in that because they are chambers, it makes it really hard to put pressure on them. So they were kind of restricted to shallow water, because if you were to just go into deeper water, the pressure would just collapse in on those chambers and just kill the animal and break its shell. So that's sort of the main limitation early on them. But then throughout the Ordovician period, which is it's sort of basically all through like the early 400 million years or so like 480 to 440 or so, they got up off the ocean, were being these main predators, and then around this time, some of those ice cream cone shapes started to curl into the shapes that we see of these swirly-shelled squid boys. And initially, some of them took some different strategies to whether it curls sort of forward toward the front or backward toward the back. And there's different advantages to doing each way. But eventually, curling sort of over the face of the animal is what won out, because that allows you to not be upside down. It's basically like if you're holding a balloon, you want your head, you want to be underneath it so that you stay upward. Whereas if you're sitting on top of a balloon, you tip over and then you're upside down in the water.
Yeah, that makes sense. Just trying to stay upright, like you were saying.
Yeah. And so even though that is the very typical shape that we see of these as these swirly shells, there were still a ton of them that stayed with relatively straight shells. And around this point in the Ordovician period is when their evolution starts to get kind of complicated. So to sort of make it a little easier for us to talk about, we're going to sort of focus on each group at a time. So we're not trying to juggle all the different names around, talk about the same time period.
Mm-hmm.
So first we're going to talk about the nautiloids, which are the shelled ones that we still have today. These nautiloids, like I said, some of them were curling their shells, some of them kept pretty straight shells and were still doing pretty well. And then throughout the Ordovician period, the Silurian period, the Devonian period, the Carboniferous period, and the Permian period, all told, over 220 million years of time, they're just doing pretty hunky-dory in general and don't change a whole lot. Some of them get some cool ornamentation on their shells, like different spikes that come off of them as just sort of a predator defense, because, like I said, even the shelled ones are still pretty tasty. And so, throughout this entire time period, their general body plan doesn't change a whole lot. And they were, by far, at least from what we can tell, because the other ones are soft and squishy and don't leave fossils, they were sort of the dominant group of cephalopods around. Particularly in the earliest part of this stretch, they were, like I said, likely some of the largest predatory animals, possibly even just the largest animals on the planet, full stop. Given that some of the straight-shelled ones, in particular, having shells over 20 feet long. So just imagine a 20-foot-long ice cream cone with a squid coming out of it. And,
20? I mean,
yep.
Jeez. Okay. That seems
and
heavy.
Then, yes, very heavy. And there was actually even one report that I found where there was one of these, they're called orthocones, is what the straight ones are called, being found from around Watertown, New York, which is more or less where I'm from, that was estimated to be about 30 feet long.
Mm-hmm.
So that is larger than great white shark size. And that's just the cone. So these were very big, or at least could be very big.
Massive.
Yeah, huge. However, they do decrease in abundance and size throughout the Devonian period. So this is the time period where fish were becoming really prominent in the oceans. Before this, they were just kind of around, but not the major players in the ocean like they are today. But it was around this time where they start to be. And so, because fish are very maneuverable and just very good, they have a different way of maintaining buoyancy and agility in the water. And because of this increased competition, because a lot of fish are also predatory, this is when the cephalopods started to sort of decrease in being the top dogs in the ocean. So then, like I said, this is the Devonian period. We flash forward a couple 100 million years to the Permian period. This is from in the ballpark of 250 or so million years ago. So by this point, a lot of time has passed, and they still haven't changed all that much. But there's a big old mass extinction that we've talked about a whole bunch, called the Great Dying, at the end of the Permian period.
Not a good time.
Well, for these guys, it actually wasn't that bad.
All right.
Yeah,
Here's some good news.
Yeah, I mean, granted, it's still a mass extinction. They still, a lot of them went extinct, but all things considered, they actually did pretty well. They bounced back pretty quickly after that, only to be completely decimated by the end Triassic extinction a mere 50 million years later, with only one single genus surviving through that extinction. However, they bounce back after that pretty quickly, and then do okay throughout the Jurassic and Cretaceous periods. Now we're going from the period of 200 million years to 66 million years. So, again, doing all right. Not as well as they did previously, but still doing fine. We still find a lot of their fossils. Although, in this time period, they're not talked about all that much in like literature, like the research, because one of their cousins is doing phenomenally at this point. We'll talk about them in a little bit. At the end of the Cretaceous period, same time when all the dinosaurs go extinct, there's yet another mass extinction that the nautiloids actually do pretty well in. They seem to just kind of not care about that one either. And they bounce back pretty quickly after that from their, not significant losses. And they continue to be widespread all around the world until around 30 million years ago. And that is roughly when pinnipeds took to the water. Pinnipeds are your seals and sea leopards, sea lions, walruses, things like that. Basically, and granted, this is a correlation, potentially, not necessarily causation, but basically, when you start seeing pinniped fossils show up in an area, you stop getting nautiluses there. And also, coincidentally, in the region of like Southeast Asia that we currently have our 5 living species of nautilus in, there are no pinnipeds. So,
okay.
When the pinnipeds inevitably get there, they will finally do in the nautiloids, which will be very sad, because like I said, they've not changed a whole lot over the last, effectively, 400 plus million years.
That's a long-ass time.
Yeah. And so that is the nautiloids. So we're going to rewind a little bit and go back to the part where it gets a little confusing. That was to avoid as much confusion as possible.
Okay.
Now we're going to talk about... Yes, we're going to talk about the more famous swirly-shelled squid boys, called the ammonoids. Or ammonites, as you've probably more commonly heard them.
Oh yeah, totally.
So, around the late Silurian period, so this is around 420 million years ago, a group of the nautiloids split off, and that group is called the Bactritida. Don't worry about it, it's not important. And they started doing some things differently with their embryonic development. Not important for our purposes, but just know that this group started doing some different things with how it went from just a fertilized egg cell to the actual animal. And that's what made them different to start with. And that's how good the fossils are with these things, is that we have fossil embryos and stuff that we can know this kind of thing. And this group, that Bactritida, were mostly straight-shelled, but very quickly some of them started curling their shells just like the nautiluses did, but totally independently. Both groups started off with straight shells and then curled them separately. And the main difference is how they add new chambers, like the walls that separate, that they can fill with gas and stuff. So when they do that, they have to like attach the wall to like the cone that is now curled, if that makes sense. And in the nautiloids, they just do a pretty simple job. The part where the wall connects to the outside of the shell is called a suture. And their sutures are very straight and fairly simple. With the ammonoids, they make them much more complicated. So if you look at an ammonite fossil where you can see the sutures, it literally looks like have you ever seen like an earthquake seismogram where it's just like the lines going back and forth a lot?
Oh yeah.
That's basically what it looks like, where it's just that back and forth really complicated pattern. Compared to a relatively straight, maybe slightly curved line in the nautiloids. And the difference is here is that I think the nautiloid, just more simple, made it more pressure resistant, which is why nautilus can live a little bit deeper in the ocean than we think ammonoids could. But this allowed more control over the filling and emptying of the chambers, at least from what I was able to find. This more complicated pattern. And so, those are the ammonoids, and over time, so these, like I said, split off in the Silurian, but then as we get closer to the age of dinosaurs, they really explode. And so over time, those sutures get more and more complicated. So by the time they go extinct, spoilers, 66 million years ago, is when we see like that sort of seismograph, extremely complex pattern at the end. But they sort of get there over time. And the reason why we don't talk about the nautiloids while the dinosaurs were around is because the ammonites were everywhere. Extremely common. Not at all... they're basically like the sardines of the oceans that the dinosaurs would have swum in if they swam much. And then, once again, they kind of take the reverse to a lot of the extinctions that the nautiloids went through. So the extinctions that the nautiloids did well in, these guys were terrible. So the Permian extinction, nautiloids did pretty okay. These guys were nearly wiped out. The Triassic extinction, nautiloids really bad. These guys still bad, but not as bad. And then the extinction at the end of the Cretaceous that wiped out the dinosaurs, these guys go totally extinct.
Really?
Yeah, we do not have these anymore.
Oh.
So that is the two main groups of like hard-shelled cephalopods. But we still have all the soft, squishy ones. And as you can probably guess, being soft and squishy, they don't have much of a fossil record at all.
So how do we know they even exist?
So a lot of it is, we do have some fossils, I will say that. Even things like octopus, we have some fossils. I believe the oldest octopus we have is somewhere around 50 million years old, 50. However, based on genetic stuff, it's probable that they were around way before that. We have no real way to confirm that, short of finding just exceptional fossils. But by studying sort of the few fossils that we do have, by studying the living species, and by all those thousands of species of extinct cephalopods that like aren't in this group but are related, we can try to get the general idea of their history. So from that same Bactritida group that the ammonoids came from that started to swirl their shells, another group sort of came separately from that called the belemnites that eventually, basically, they took the basic squid body plan. So imagine just a regular squid.
Yep.
And at the very tip of their mantle, the sort of end of the torpedo, the opposite end of the arms and tentacles, they had an internal shell that was like a really hard and pointy at the end. And so they basically, these are actually very common fossils. They look almost kind of like bullets. And they're about that same size and general shape as well.
Okay.
Which has led to a lot of very interesting mythology things, or just things throughout the years of people are like, this is a weird looking bullety shaped thing in the ground here. I wonder how that got here. And so this group, the belemnites, are very common fossils all the way through until I believe they go extinct around the end of the Cretaceous as well, same time as the ammonites. And it's likely that squid, including the cuttlefish, evolved from somewhere within this group, or at least closely related. And I believe the earliest squid gladius, their internal shell, shows up sometime in the early Devonian period, sometime around 400 million years ago, 415. But you can't tell a lot about a squid from its internal shell. You can tell a couple things, but nothing like super important.
Right.
So it's like if you just find a squid gladius or a squid pen, sometimes it's called, which I think is funny because they make ink. You'll find it, but it's like that doesn't really tell you anything. Just this is a squid. And so it's also likely that they split with the squid and octopus split sometime around here as well, in sort of the high 300s of millions of years ago. But like I said, we have like 4 octopus fossils. So, and that is pretty much all we got. This was an insultingly brief foray into the cephalopods, given that, like I said, over 17,000 named fossil species. That is almost triple the amount of living mammals today. And that's fossils.
Yeah, when you phrase it because with all of these numbers and quite a lot of what we talk about in this podcast, I have no context for what any of them are. Is that big? Is that small? Is that I just don't know. But putting in that context, 3 times as many as are currently living.
Yeah.
That that puts it into pretty good perspective for you.
Right, and like I said, this includes basically none of the squishy ones, which make up the vast majority of them today.
Wow.
So.
Wow.
Yeah.
So yeah, that number just got orders of magnitude bigger.
Exactly. And it's not like there's just this many fossil species and you only have 1 or 2 of them. There are actual millions of specimens of these in museums, let alone all the ones that are just sitting in somebody's bookshelf or just sitting out in rocks and stuff. These are, I'd say, short of brachiopods or clams. These are by far the most common fossils in the world. They're a dime a dozen. Which means that for the ones that we have fossils of, we have great information. But that's the duality of cephalopods. I think that might be the episode title.
The duality of cephalopods. I quite like that, and we hope that you liked this episode of I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive. We will see you guys in a couple of weeks, and until then, take care, everybody.